Hey everybody, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be creating a one-layer card using the Magnolia stamp set by Hero Arts. And this is a little bit of an older stamp set. It is a mini stamp set. It's just this one single image. But we are going to be stamping this twice. And I'm going to be stamping this on the top portion of my card panel using Fade Out ink by Ink on 3 because I want this to be more of a no-line coloring look. I am going to stamp this twice just to make it easier for you guys to see. I can see it perfectly with just one stamping, so if you're not necessarily doing this on camera, only stamping it once will be fine. So once the first impression is stamped out, I'm going to go ahead and mask that out with some Simon Says stamp masking paper. I'm going to be doing a little bit of ink blending in the background, so I want to make sure I'm using a masking paper that's nice and tacky. Move that image down towards the right hand side and stamp that again twice with that same Fade Out ink, and then again mask that out with the Simon Says stamp masking paper. You want to make sure that when you're doing any ink blending in the background that your masks are cut as perfectly as you possibly can right along that line of the image itself. So once that was masked out, I wanted to create somewhat of a frame around my card panel just to add a little added interest, being it's only a one-layer card. So I'm going to take the grid mat on my work surface here as well as a T-square ruler, and my initial plan was just to draw a straight frame, but apparently I just wasn't thinking and I kind of extended my lines a little bit too far in order to make this an actual frame. So what I ended up doing was just drawing the lines all the way to the edge of the card panel, if that makes any sense. So it is still framed in, but the lines do extend past each other, if that makes sense to you guys. I am leaving my masks in place. You can either go right over your masks or you can carefully go around your images. I just decided that in certain areas I'll go around them and in certain areas I'll just go right over them. Depends on how lazy I felt at that particular moment. So once my frame was drawn in here, I guess, I am going to move on to just a little bit of ink blending. So I'm going to be using Seedless Preserves, and this is regular distress ink because I knew I'm going to be doing a little bit of Copic coloring on top, so I didn't want to use the oxides. I'm going to take a couple of strips of Post-it note tape just to mask out where I had drawn in those lines for my frame. I don't want my ink blending to extend past the center of the card. And then I'm using one of my blending brushes, and I'm going to work from the top right hand corner down and kind of fade off to white. So a majority of the color is actually going to be right directly over the masks, and then I'll kind of extend that down a little bit. I don't want a whole lot of color, but I do want to add a little bit of something to the background so it's not all completely white. So once that was done, I am going to go ahead and carefully remove my masks. For the masks on the flowers, remember that this is pretty tacky, so I'm just going to use the corner of my scissors, or actually I didn't need to because they were hanging off the edge. So you just kind of want to carefully tear these off without tearing your paper. And then we'll move on to the coloring. So to start, I'm just going to take with a very, very light hand a colored pencil just to fill in the centers of the flowers, and this is basically so I don't lose them. I'm using Fade Out ink, which does exactly what the name of it says. It fades out as you color over it, so I want to make sure that I still preserve the center of my flowers before I start my coloring. So we're going to be using Copics and colored pencils today. So I'm going to start off with my Copics, and I'm going to go right in with my darkest color. Because I'm not worried about getting the perfect blend, I plan on going in with my colored pencils afterwards. I'm not too concerned about going in with my lightest color first. So I'm just concentrating my shading being where one petal is laying over another, and some of these petals are kind of folded over on themselves, or there's some texture within the petals. There's some wrinkles or whatever you want to call it. So I'm just paying attention to those areas. These are areas that are drawn right in with the image itself. So with the illustration of the stamp, they drew in all of these texture lines. So all I'm doing is using those to my advantage to kind of guide me as far as where my shading should be. So I'll continue to go around the flower here, and typically when I do no line coloring, because you tend to lose those lines as you're coloring over them, I typically only color sometimes only one petal at a time. Sometimes I'll color 2 or 3, depending on the shape of the petals. If they're nice and easy, then I feel confident enough to do more than just one. But again, just going in with that darkest color to add those shadows where those darkest areas will be, extending that out with the RV66 and then finishing off with the RV63. And I don't know whether I mentioned it, but the darkest color that I'm using is an RV69 in case you guys can't see those caps. So I'm gonna speed this up a little bit because I did the shading pretty much the same way, but each and every petal on this flower is shaped a little bit differently. So I kept the coloring of all of it in the video just so that you can see how I colored it and where I put my shading. When you're doing your flick lines or when you're adding your dimension to the base of the petals, you want to make sure that your flick lines are going in the same direction as that petal. It will just make your blending a little bit easier, but like I said, I'm not worried about perfect blending at this point. So like I said, each petal is shaped a little bit differently. Some petals are coming right off from the center and some of them are kind of behind it. So I'm not necessarily coloring in those petals at the same time, just because it can be a little bit difficult to differentiate between the two. So you can see that it still looks very pretty with just the 3 Copic markers that I'm using, and Frankie's kind of shaking around everything here. It still looks very pretty here, but I typically use a 4-color blend for my Copics. This is only 3 because honestly, I don't have another color that kind of mixes in with these RV60s, and I love the color of these. So I wanted to add a little bit more dimension or a little bit more texture to these petals. So once my Copic coloring was done, I am going to go ahead and bring in some colored pencils, and I'm using Polychromos, but you can use any colored pencils here. You'll just want to make sure that you're picking colors that are somewhat close to what you've already used. I'm going to use 2. I'm going to use 1 dark and 1 light. And you want to make sure that you have a very fine tip on your pencil. So you're going to see that I'm going to sharpen these very often. And then I'm going in with a very, very light hand. I'm barely touching the paper here. I'm not using paper that's necessarily good for colored pencils, but I'm not worried about getting a perfect blend with my colored pencils, being I already have that base coat or that base layer of my Copics on there. Once I have that darkest color down, I'm going to go in with my lightest color and just go right over where I put the darkest and just extend it a little bit further. And I know it's hard to see on camera the difference between the two, but you'll see that it just adds a little bit more texture and kind of deepens up those shadows a little bit. And you can make these as dark or as light as you want. And this is great if you're not all that confident with your Copic markers or with your alcohol markers. You can kind of practice with the blending. If you're not necessarily happy with the results, don't trash it. Don't throw it away. Just keep working at it. And it doesn't necessarily need to be with the same medium as you started off with. So if you don't get those perfect blends that you're looking for with your alcohol markers, try adding in something extra or something different like your colored pencils to kind of deepen those up or soften them out a little bit. And you'll see that you'll get totally different results. And it's a great way to practice with both of them. So I'm just going to go around, like I said, I'm going to show you this entire flower. I will not show you the second whole flower, but I'm going to just show you everything here just so that you can kind of see where I'm placing those shadows and how much of them I'm adding. I'm not covering in this entire petal with that lightest color. I'm just basically extending those darkest areas down just a little bit. My lightest pencil is a little bit darker than my lightest Copic, just so that you can kind of see the difference, and that does add a little bit more texture. If you add one that is too light or too close to your highlight color for your Copics, you're not even going to notice that you did it. So like I always say with the Copics, add those scary darks. That's what's going to give you all of that dimension that you're looking for. So just finishing this flower up, and then we're going to move on to the other flower. And I wanted to try a different color combination. Even though I love this color combination, I wanted to try something a little bit different because quite honestly, this is a little bit different for me using the colored pencils on top of the Copics. So the next flower is actually going to be a white flower. So I'm going to leave some white space, but I'm going to switch over to my cool gray markers to add my shading. I'm just going to show you a little bit of this because I pretty much did this the same exact way, or at least colored it the same exact way as I did my first flower, but obviously it's going to be a different color combination. Going directly in first with my C5, which is my darkest color, adding in those very darkest areas at the base of the petal where one petal overlaps or when one petal is kind of folded over on itself. Then extending those areas out with the C3, and then finally going in with the C1. But you'll see that I am still leaving white space because I want this flower to appear white. I'm just going to be adding the shadows. Anything white still does have shadows to it. So like I said, I went around the entire flower, colored this the same exact way as I did the first, leaving that white space this time though. And next I'm going to bring in some more colored pencils, and these are called cold grays for the Polychromos, but like I said, you can use any pencils here. And again, doing the same exact thing, just darkening up those shadows in those very darkest areas with my darker pencil here, using just a very fine tip and a very, very light hand. If you're not getting the dimension you're looking for, add a little bit more shadow wherever you want to. You don't necessarily have to go exactly the way the stamp or the image is illustrated. You can always add a little bit something extra if you feel that it needs it. But just remember, those lines and those textures and the illustration itself is drawn to help you place those shadows where they should be. So going in with a lighter pencil, extending those areas out again with a very, very, very light hand, it's almost going to be not noticeable when you're adding this color. So just keep that in mind, that you don't have to press too hard. Even though you may not notice it, once you finish that petal, you will notice a difference. It's just not noticeable when you're actually doing it. If that makes sense to you guys. So once the flowers were complete, I'm going to go ahead and color in the centers, and there are some lines, I guess there's some texture within the center. So I'm taking my darker pencil here, and I'm just pretty much doing little tiny flicks or little tiny dots with a pretty heavy hand, because I don't want these little texture lines to kind of fade away once I add more color. And the more color you add, the more it'll blend. But if you add enough of it, if you press too hard, you won't blend it, which is what I want in this case. Just going to add a little bit of the darker color on the base of the center here, blend that out with the mid-tone. This is going in with a pretty light hand, and then going back in with that lightest color that we had started off with in the beginning, just for the very tip of the center. Next, going in with the leaves here, going in with what was originally going to be my lightest color, adding a shadow where this leaf is tucked behind this flower, and then kind of toward up the center of the flower, the leaf. Each leaf is kind of shaped a little bit differently, so I'm going to color them each differently. Going in with the G3, extending those areas out, and then I finished off with the YG23, and I did not like it. It was a little bit too, it wasn't bright enough for me. I wanted a little bit more of a bright YG, so I did switch over to the YG03 instead, and then I brought in my G28 as my darkest color instead of that G07, just because I wanted to darken up those shadow areas and add a little bit more dimension to my leaves here. So extending that out with the G07, which is now my darkest mid-tone. G03 will be my lightest mid-tone, and then I'll switch over to the YG03 as my lightest color. I'm not going to be able to completely get rid of that YG23, but because Copics are not opaque, they are more transparent, it will alter the color a little bit, so it will brighten it up just a little bit. But I will go in with my colored pencils again to deepen up these shadows and soften up these areas a little bit. Again, using a color that's more close to the G28, maybe even a little bit darker. And then I'll go in with a lighter green, but still darker than my lightest color to kind of soften those areas out. Again, I'm not going to show you all of the leaves. I'm just going to show you a few here just so that you can see the different ways that I did color them. For this second leaf that's kind of tucked behind this one, I created a shadow where it is laying underneath that other leaf. also where it's laying underneath the flower, and also added a little bit of shading to the tip of the leaf, and this will kind of make it appear as if this leaf is kind of bent or bowed out a little bit by leaving that center highlight. Again, going in with my colored pencils and just deepening up those shadows and softening them out a little bit. And then I'll kind of just move around the image again. So always going in with my darkest color, just because I don't feel the need to go in with the lightest color as I normally do, being I'm going to be adding even more shading with those pencils. So it does save a little bit of time. You would think that it would take a little bit longer, but actually I probably colored these two images a little bit quicker than I normally do by not having to add layer after layer of my Copics like I normally do for that perfect blend. So again, just filling in these with my lightest color, then going in with the colored pencils to deepen and soften out those shadows. And then I just kind of continued all around with the rest of the leaves, pretty much coloring them whatever shape they appeared to be. It doesn't really matter if you're not comfortable adding shading on the tip and the base. Don't. Just color it the way you feel comfortable. So once all of my coloring was finally complete, I'm going to add a drop shadow, and I'm going to switch over to my warm gray markers because I've already used the cool gray markers. So when you do this, you want to pick a light source. I picked the light source being in the top right, so all my shadowing is going to be in the bottom left. So wherever your light source is, your shading or your shadow is going to be in the opposite. So I'm going to start off with the W5, and I'm basically just outlining the image where off to the bottom left. So anything that's kind of sticking out, I may add a little bit of shading to the left-hand side of it, like that one leaf on the top. Then switching over to the W3 or the warm gray 3, and I'm just going to extend that W5 out a little bit. So I'm going directly over where I placed that W5 and just extending it out a little bit further. Now you can go with a straight line here, but here I am just using a little bit of a flicking motion to get these colors to blend a little bit easier. Then finally going in with the W1 and extending these shadows out even further. You can see that I flicked way too far on that one there. Not sure what I was thinking there. I thought I was maybe coloring an image there. So I'll just go over that area with my colorless blender to get rid of that large flick there that I have. Being it's such a light color, I'll have no problem doing that. And I never have a problem using my colorless blender over regular Distress ink, but not Distress oxides. So once all of that was done, you can see that one line that I drew in for my frame was a little bit wider on the bottom, which I wasn't liking. So I'm going to switch over to another EK Success Journaling pen here, but this has a larger tip. This is the 0.65. So it's a lot thicker. And I'm just going to go over my lines to make them a little bit more even, to make them the same thickness, I guess. I'm sure there's a better term for that. So just bringing out my T-square ruler again, making sure everything was completely straight, and I go over those same lines that I had already created. And then I am going to go ahead and add my sentiment, and the sentiment is from this same stamp set. And I am using black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp. This is my favorite ink to use for sentiments. It dries immediately and gives you a very crisp impression. I'm going to just go ahead and stamp that right directly below my flowers. And then to finish off the card, I'm going to bring in some Cloud 9 Dream Drops by Nuvo and just add those, a few on the top and few on the bottom of the sentiment. And that is it. That is the card for today. As always, I will leave a list of all of the supplies I used in the description box below. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and have a great day, guys. Bye.